Hello and welcome to the Advances in Dryland Farming Systems series. This webinar will be addressing integrated weed management. My name is Ian C. Burke and I'm a weed scientist here at Washington State University. My presentation will be addressing weed biology to begin with. Knowledge of the biology of weed pests is critical for effective integrated weed management. The presentation will work through the important integrated management tools that we have for managing weeds, including some discussion of herbicides, and then we'll talk about how to, and the process you need to use to develop a weed management plan. Weeds are primarily annual species. That is, they germinate, emerge, and set seed in a single growing season. Although some of our more problematic weed species are definitely perennial species, the majority of our weed pests are annuals. And that life cycle is presented here, where the seed present in the seed bank form the foundation and a protective buffer for activities above ground. The seed generally germinate and emerge, usually with the crop or just after the crop. And it's in that period of time that we are actively trying to manage them. If we fail, ultimately that can cause crop interference, where there's some measurable yield loss due to the competition with the weeds. And ultimately the weed is out to set seed. It's the measure of any weed success is its ability to reproduce. So the plants will produce seed and drop their seed in a process we call seed rain. So an inherent in any understanding of the pest, the weed biology, is a knowledge of and operational management of the seed bank. To manage the seed bank, or to think about seed bank principles, it's important to understand that weeds are, like all biological organisms, highly in tune with their environment. And so germination processes that govern weed germination and emergence include a whole host of factors, including resources and soil conditions. The weeds usually have inherent biological characteristics that may prevent germination even when presented with the ideal conditions. We call that seed dormancy. Also present in the soil matrix are a whole host of predators, including insects and diseases that might prey on weed seed. Ultimately, a vast majority of the weed seed present in the seed bank are usually lost to decay and embryo death over time. And so management of the seed bank has become a critical emphasis in any sort of management program. Reducing the amount of seed that returns to the seed bank should be an imperative of any sort of integrated weed management strategy. We know a lot about the duration weed seed lasts in the seed bank. This slide gives some assessment of the important weed species found in the Pacific Northwest, separated by grasses and broadleaves. And you can see many of our grass species have a very short duration in the seed bank, often no more than 3 or 4 years before there's a really visible difference in the amount of weed seed germinating. Grasses just don't last very long in the seed bank. If you're successful in managing them over that very short period of time and you eliminate any sort of seed deposits into the seed bank, usually you can observe a measurable reduction in the infestation you have in your fields. Broadleaves, though, have quite a bit more variation. Some of our most common weed species, like common lamb's quarters and mayweed chamomile, can persist in the seed bank for a decade or more. And it's thought that lamb's quarters, some lamb's quarter seed can persist for as long as 100 years. So those sorts of weeds, once they become established, often are a problem for your entire career. Ultimately, the emphasis of seed bank management is reducing seed persistence, weed seed persistence, and reducing the safe sites or eliminating the safe sites for the germination and emergence. What you wind up with is a conceptual framework that looks like this, where because of management inputs and practices, management of the seed bank, there's a reduction in the viable seed present in the seed bank over time, thus hopefully reducing the amount of energy and effort expended later after you've managed the seed bank to extinction. And in fact, when we look historically over multiple decades, we can see changes in the weed composition in fields because of changes in management practices. So next on the list is reducing weed establishment. There are a whole host of processes that govern germination, emergence, and survival of weeds, again including resources, in particular light and fertility. Those often govern germination and emergence to a large degree for many of our weed species. Also critical are the seed size, and that plays a role in how deep the weed seed can germinate and emerge successfully, the depth at which they can germinate and emerge successfully, and also surface residues play a large role in the weed's ability to survive that germination and establishment process. Also active in this period of time potentially are predators and pathogens. Just like our crop species, there are pathogens that affect many of our weed species. And so the guiding principles for reducing weed establishment, although they usually include conventional inputs that we're going to discuss here in a minute, but could also include stimulation of processes that would mitigate their survival in that germination process. So ultimately, you get a graph that looks a little bit like this. So there's a reduction in weed seedling establishment over time, so that the numbers of weeds that you are dealing with on any given time period are reduced, or any given season are reduced. The final process I'll discuss in terms of biology is the interference of the weed with the crop. Weeds are usually what we would call luxury users of resources. They use far more resources than they're capable of turning into yield. Our crops have been specifically bred to be efficient users of resources. Weeds are not. And so we have a tendency to see them use far more nitrogen at a time when the crop is really in need of those resources, and that can have a real impact on yield. And so resources and soil conditions, relative time of emergence, the use efficiency of the resources, all can play a role in how weeds compete with the crop and reduce yield. Also governing that process is biomass allocation. Weeds are prolific in their growth and can produce a large amount of biomass in a very short period of time. In our water-limiting environment here in the Pacific Northwest, every a bit of moisture is critical for above-ground growth of our crops, and weeds are very efficient at removing water early in the season before the crops really begin to produce the yield that we would like to harvest. And so management of weeds in that critical period is essential for protecting yield. So ultimately you get a conceptual framework that looks a little bit like this, where you have crop yield loss on the vertical axis and weed density on the horizontal axis, and by reducing weed density by whatever means necessary, ultimately can protect yield in the field season. Like other crop pests, weed scientists have developed critical periods for management of weeds. They're not used as broadly or as widely as what they would be for insect pests, primarily because weeds are so destructive. The density required to cause a yield loss in many of our crop species is often on the order of one weed for 10 square yards or even less. And so the guiding principles for management of weeds is you have to manage weeds every year, and there's no density that would maybe stimulate an input. One of the few weed management periods management periods I've found to be particularly useful is the critical period of weed control, and that's pictured here, where there's a very specific critical period during the crop growth and development where it's highly sensitive to weed interference. Weeds present in the crop before that time or after that time usually don't cause a yield loss. Weeds present during that critical period do cause a yield loss, and so that becomes a very good and handy threshold for timing of inputs to manage weeds. Keeping your crop weed-free during that critical period is essential for protecting as much yield as possible. It becomes less of an issue before and after that critical period. The critical period can be articulated in a lot of different ways. Almost all of us are real comfortable working in the Julian calendar. Of course, crops and weeds work on primarily heat units, and that's exhibited here by growing degree days. But there's also provided here several different growth stage measurements for wheat. And in this instance, this is for winter wheat. Spring wheat and other spring crops would have critical periods that would occur not long after planting and would end often several to many weeks afterward, depending on how competitive those particular crops are. Reducing or potentially eliminating the critical period of weed control is a primary emphasis of integrated weed management as well. So that brings me to weed management specifically, and I'm going to begin with the toolbox. Many of the producers I work with can readily identify multiple items on this as being critical for just good crop growth and development. Basic agronomy is a key and essential ingredient for integrated weed management. So anything you can do to make that crop more competitive will ultimately improve your weed management. So things like row spacing, seeding rate, planting date, crop cultivar even plays an important role. The biggest impact is usually due to crop rotation, but other inputs like mulches or fertility management and increasingly we're seeing interest in cover crops can also play a role in integrated weed management. In addition to that, there's mechanical weed management, including primary and secondary tillage. Primary tillage usually is thought of as the tillage that occurs in preparation to plant your crop, but it also can have a profound impact on the seed bank, particularly if you use inversion tillage and you're capable of burying the seed to a depth where it can't germinate and emerge. Secondary tillage is primarily thought of as the tillage we use to manage weeds, either before or during crop growth and development, and to a certain extent, flaming or burning is also thought of as a mechanical weed management input. And then there's the chemical weed management. I think everyone understands what the role of herbicides are. I'm not going to spend much time talking about them specifically because there's a wealth of resources for those, but chemical weed management, of course, is the primary means we use to manage weeds. But integrated weed management includes all these other strategies and chemical weed management working together in concert to provide the most efficient weed management possible. Just to give you a few examples of how the impact of some of those cultural inputs, how impactful those cultural inputs can be for weed management, this slide shows the crop growth and development just 16 days after planting. This is winter wheat, and the winter wheat was planted at 2 different densities. So at a 50% of the seeding rate, a typical seeding rate here in the high rainfall zone of the inland Pacific Northwest, you can see that there's a significant amount of soil showing through that wheat canopy compared to what the canopy looks like when we seed at about 125% of the typical seeding rate, or nearly 150 pounds per acre. And ideally what you want to do is develop crop growth or work to have crop growth and development as rapidly as possible to shade the ground. Many of our weed species are highly sensitive to light and can sense light, and reducing or eliminating light penetration to the soil surface can reduce or eliminate seed germination and emergence. So that brings me to a broad view of the integrated weed management systems I'm going to discuss today, and a conceptual framework for a view of that integrated weed management system that incorporates both all those cultural inputs I've just discussed, including crop spacing, crop population, and cultivar, in addition to planting date and ultimately crop rotation. Crop rotation is by far the most effective way to manage weeds because of the changes on a year-to-year cycle as exhibited here in our wheat, pulse, and then a legume, forage legume rotation. The changes on a yearly basis make it very difficult for weeds to adapt to a particular system. So it's quite common for an integrated weed management system to include a rotation where a grass crop is rotated to a broadleaf crop, and in more integrated systems include forage systems like this, for example, where in addition to the crop rotation that's going on, there's also an incorporation of different inputs for management, including, in this case, mowing, as indicated by these small red tractors. When you sum all those inputs up, the crop rotation, the canopy developed by that crop is indicated by the multicolored bars, the herbicides applied, the tillage applied. What you want to see is a wide diversity of inputs and timings throughout the season. That makes it very difficult for weeds to adapt to the system you're deploying. Inherent in any of this system is an understanding that a herbicide pictured here or a tillage event pictured here would also be changeable, and so you would not want to depend on just any one particular kind of herbicide or kind of tillage. There would be flexibility and change built into the system as well. I'll go through just a couple of examples of common systems here in the inland Pacific Northwest. This is a slide that shows the wheat fallow rotation and a summation of the events that occur as part of that wheat fallow rotation. Of course, the fallow period is a period where we rely on rainfall and our excellent soils to accumulate enough moisture to grow the crop the following season. And it's definitely a risk avoidance mechanism. It also allows us to apply a number of different inputs when there's no crop present. And so the system, even though we're only monocropping every other year, is actually relatively integrated because of the variation of inputs we can apply in the fallow year. And this particular example is a chemical fallow system where there's very little tillage deployed. In this instance, the tillage that I've got pictured here might be considered maybe a residue management, but not a deep tillage. And there's likely a significant amount of disturbance going on at planting to prepare or use a deep fallow or deep furrow planting system. Ultimately, when you sum that up, you can see that there's a lot of variation in the timing of herbicide inputs within season. There's usually a very rapid canopy development because it's a winter crop. Winter wheat is very competitive with weeds. And so there's a lot of opportunity here for varying the inputs that occur outside of the cropping system, outside of the actual growth of the crop. That compares rather interestingly to perhaps a little bit more intensive system that would occur in the intermediate or high rainfall zone where we're potentially growing a spring wheat, a spring pulse, likely potentially even a winter wheat, but maybe we're rotating that with a forage legume like alfalfa. And in this instance, you can also see that there's a wide diversity of inputs occurring throughout the season. Tillage, herbicide inputs, mowing events occur in a way that make it very difficult for any one weed species to adapt to this particular system. Of course, that also assumes that there's change going on in the herbicide programs as well to make sure you're using a diversity of inputs. It's pretty easy to assess the risk of herbicide resistance. Herbicide resistance has been a growing problem in our region for many years because of our over-reliance on herbicides. Traditional thinking was that we needed to rotate our herbicide modes of action, but recent research has identified that in fact what we need to be doing is applying 2 or more herbicide modes of action on a particular weed species, either in a systems approach or in a mixture together. There needs to be more than one mode of action for management of that particular weed species. In some instances, particularly for our grass weeds like downy brome and Italian ryegrass, there's enough resistance out there that it may well be not possible to do that given the current state of our herbicide technology. But you can see here on this chart that you can assess your potential for developing herbicide resistance by asking some very simple questions. Are you in a system where you've got both cultural and mechanical methods of weed management that are also very active on a particular weed species, or are you over-reliant and only managing weeds with chemicals alone? In that last example where you're only using chemicals alone, you'd likely develop herbicide resistance quite quickly. If you're using the same herbicide mode of action year after year, or many times in the same season, you're likely to also be at a high risk for herbicide resistance development. If you're using limited or no rotation, you're also at very high risk. So deploying as many different potential crop rotations as you can, or understanding how to incorporate diversity in that very simple wheat fallow system is also critical. One of the aspects of herbicide resistance I've discovered here in the Pacific Northwest is that many of us are quite unaware of what mode of action or what the current status of our herbicide resistance is. And so if you have questions about whether or not you have herbicide resistance, it's possible to have that tested in multiple places. And it's definitely worth reaching out to your extension specialist or to myself to have that weed potentially tested. Another good indicator of whether or not you're at risk of developing resistance would be whether or not you have a very high weed infestation. It's definitely a numbers game for herbicide resistance in weeds. The more weeds that are exposed to an input, the greater the likelihood they are to adapt to it. And so maintaining your weeds at a very low level, a very low population is important. And in general, if you are not achieving effective control or management of a weed species using a herbicide input where it used to really work well, is usually a very good sign that you've got a potential issue. So that brings me to the process of developing a weed management plan. It's a 4-step process that involves the preliminary steps of identifying the weed, mapping where the weeds occur, and working to identify preventative strategies for managing weeds. The next step would be identifying control options, taking advantage of all those tools that we have in the toolbox to manage weeds. Usually there's a systems development process that goes on where different inputs are chosen for different reasons or how well they fit into a system. And important questions need to be asked there, like what can be done or what should be done about the particular weed species that occur in your system. And then finally, the last step in developing weed management plan is the actual system implementation. And that should include careful record keeping and evaluation of the management on a regular basis. So I'll spend a little bit more time talking about each of these individual aspects. When it comes to problem diagnosis, knowing your weed species is very critical. Knowing where the weeds are and mapping them is very critical. But also inherent in that is understanding of the soils that you're working with. Texture, soil conditions, the colloidal components, pH can all play a role in understanding what tools you may be able to deploy, particularly tools like herbicides. These soil attributes can play a large role in how persistent many of our herbicides are and could potentially cause some limitation or a reduction in flexibility. So knowing what you've got in terms of soil is critical in addition to those other attributes. Also important in diagnosing your problem is an understanding of the potential for soil erosion. In the last 30 years, we made great strides in reducing or eliminating soil erosion using relatively innovative minimum till or no-till systems. But that's also reduced our reliance on tillage for weed management. And so understanding how different tillage inputs might or might not increase the propensity for soil erosion is a critical factor for choosing whether or not to not use tillage at all. Also inherent in a decision process is understanding what kind of non-target species and limitations you might have in terms of being able to deploy a particular input. Herbicides are known to potentially move off target, and understanding how that process works and working to mitigate or eliminate it is critical as well. Once you have a good sense for what the problems are and you've diagnosed the problems well enough and have a good sense for what the limitations might be for your particular environment, you can begin to itemize the important tools you would be using to manage weeds. Of course, inherent in that are many of the decisions you would normally make in the process of growing crops, like choosing good competitive crop varieties, choosing a planter that has a row spacing that would also contribute to weed competition or crop competition with the weeds. All of those work together, but there's also conscious decisions that you need to make, like picking good, clean seed to plant, using good, clean equipment, making sure that you're aware of what's going on adjacent sites and understand the mobility of some of these weed species, isolating potential new infestations in a way that mitigates their spread, by cleaning your equipment and prioritizing which fields you enter and exit. All of those play a role. The most important cultural input is crop rotation. So being able to plan your crop rotations and doing so with the knowledge you have the flexibility to rotate successfully is a critical part of the management plan, particularly when you're choosing herbicides that might potentially limit your crop rotation. Mechanical control, of course, is an important aspect and one of the critical components of an integrated weed management system. There are a number of producers who have chosen to not till, and in general, when you move to a minimum or no-till system, there should be a conscious effort to find other mechanisms to manage those weeds in the absence of that tillage, or at least knowledge that you need to be flexible and potentially deploy tillage at strategic times to manage a particularly damaging pest. And then finally, there's the decision to use herbicides, and that should be done with good knowledge of what those herbicides are and what they might mean for your system. So I'll go through some thoughts on program selection. When you're designing a weed management plan, of course, you've got to be able to have the ability to do that. You've got to have the equipment to deploy a particular input, be it tillage or a pesticide. You've got to have the operational capability. If you have too much going on at any one time, you may not be very timely on a particular input. And so having the operational capability to deploy an input is a critical assessment. And some of that assessment should include whether or not you need a custom service of some sort to manage those pests as timely as possible. Time, I've discovered for many of our large growers, is a very limiting factor, and understanding and knowing where your limitations are and trusting others to manage a particular aspect of your weed management plan is an important consideration. I can't overemphasize the value of early season programs in weed management. We have a tendency to apply our herbicides a little too late. We wait for those weeds to germinate and get as many as possible to germinate, and as a consequence, we're applying some of our inputs when the weeds are likely not as susceptible as they would have been if we had been more timely. And so one of the ways we can adjust that and give ourselves a little bit more flexibility is to use a pre-emergent herbicide that would reduce or eliminate, or at least forestall the germination and emergence of weed species until a time that we have a little bit more flexibility in our system to manage them later. So early season programs should and do play a critical role for weed management by allowing you to be a little bit more timely in your operations. And of course, it goes without saying that economics play a large role in many of the decisions you'll make when you're developing a weed management plan. Herbicides in particular are among the most expensive inputs that growers face on any given season, rivaling that of the fertility inputs. And so understanding how to take advantage of and maximize the benefit of all those inputs that you're already paying for, like those cultural inputs like seed and crop row spacing, making sure that those are working as efficiently and as effectively as possible before adding the herbicide systems, and you'll usually see a return on the investment of getting those inputs maximized. Finally, there's the program execution. Getting your operations out at the right time is very critical. Waiting for or forestalling inputs or managing too much at any one time can and often does cause reduction in weed management. It's very critical that the timing is observed as much as possible. Making sure your equipment's functioning right as it should on a regular basis, keeping it operational and well calibrated is really very critical for operations, including those herbicide applications, but also including effective seed placement in the soil by your planter and a host of other processes that need to happen that are important for crop growth and development. You also need to be prepared to evaluate your method. It's always important to reflect on what the effectiveness was on a particular input. And just because an input fails on any given season, you should be willing to and flexible enough to try and understand why it might have failed and be willing to reevaluate it in a different way. And so what we often recommend is that if there's a particularly new input you're going to try out that you don't deploy it on a widespread basis, that you're prepared to experiment and understand how to gain the most out of that new input on a smaller scale before deploying it on a widespread basis. Effectiveness is very important. Consistency and outcome is also very important. So if you have a particular input that you have found to be very consistent over the years, but the consistency is reducing or declining over time, then there's usually a really good reason to go in and understand why that consistency is declining. A consistency and outcome where you have a very high level of weed control is very important, and if you see that change, you need to be prepared to understand why it's changing. Of course, any input should have a fit within your individual system. If you're not capable of deploying the input, or it doesn't fit because it limits potentially your crop rotation, then you should be prepared to understand and manage around that limitation. Fit is also very critical. The flexibility you might have or might gain by using a particular input is also critical to evaluate. As I indicated before, pre-emergent herbicides can in some circumstances increase your flexibility by delaying weed emergence later in the spring. And so it might allow you to have more flexibility in the timing of post-emergence herbicide applications as an example of how certain inputs can increase your flexibility. And of course, it's always important to understand and know how your past weed management systems worked and what those results were. Again, it's about being reflective and understanding what works, what doesn't, what you might be able to get by without, and what is critical. All of that plays a role in your method evaluation as you design a weed management plan. So putting all four of those elements together into a weed management plan where you have preliminary steps and are actively working to understand the problem, where you identify the control options for that particular weed, you develop a system to manage that weed, and then implement that system, all should be occurring with the knowledge that you need to be flexible and be thoughtful and reflective on how the system is working, and be prepared to do things that need to be done. So some final thoughts. It's important to be realistic. You don't have to control all the weeds all the time to be successful. There's a growing consensus within the weed science discipline that we really probably should be having a zero tolerance for seed production, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to control the weed. Knowing that you've successfully managed weed seed production as best as possible does not necessarily mean you've completely killed all the weeds. So being realistic about the outcome is critical. So an inherent in the scientific approach is really a sensible and realistic attitude about weeds and the degree of weed management that a system or a new existing technology might provide. So keep these generalizations in mind. Crop growth is always the primary goal. There is no better weed management input than a good competitive crop. And everything you can do to make that crop as competitive as possible will increase your weed control. Once a weed is established, it's probably going to be a problem for a long period of time because the weed seed can persist for some years in the seed bank. So if a new weed is appearing on your property or in your fields, understanding and reacting as rapidly as possible to mitigate its ability to spread into your property is critical. Once it's there, it's going to be a potential problem for the rest of your career. A single application of anything won't control all the weeds all the time. There is no silver bullet. You've got to be cognizant that there are weeds that are out there adapting to a particular input, and you've got to have a diversity of inputs managing your weeds to be successful in weed management. A program with several stages or approaches is often quite a bit more effective than a more simple program. So even though I've given a few examples of pretty integrated systems, over-reliance on the same herbicide plan or the same herbicide system year after year is not a good weed management approach. And you need to have potentially several different timings of herbicides, for example, and several additional inputs, including mechanical approaches to manage weeds. The more complex the program in general, the more effective it is. And in general, elimination of any one practice often necessitates the replacement with another. So if you've decided to reduce or eliminate tillage in your system, understand that you placed a much heavier burden on your herbicide programs for management. Herbicides, because of the development of herbicide resistance, herbicides should be viewed as a technology that will eventually fail, and being practical and pragmatic and understanding that you may have to incorporate some amount of tillage at some point is critical. I'll reemphasize that there's no new transformative herbicide technology coming along. The number of herbicide patents has been in steady decline since the advent of transgenic of glyphosate-resistant crops, and the expectation that a new herbicide or new herbicide system coming along and helping should just be viewed as a potential stopgap, and understand that these technologies have a lifespan, and managing your program with as much other inputs as possible to mitigate weeds adapting to the herbicides you're using is a critical part of the integrated management plan. And finally, do try and keep in mind that you will eventually select for a weed that can survive in your management program, unless that program is dynamic and flexible. So I encourage you to be as dynamic and as flexible as possible in thinking through how to manage these weed species using the tools I provided here. Thank you.